In this video, we will look at the executions carried out in the United States during the month of November. We'll walk through the crimes that put them on death row, the final words they spoke, and the last meals they requested before facing execution. But before we start, let us know in the comments where you are watching this from. The first execution of the month took place on November 13, 2025. After spending more than 45 years on death row, Bryan Frederick Jennings was executed by lethal injection in Florida. But what did he do to end up there? In the early morning hours of May 11, 1979, 6-year-old Rebecca Kunash was still sound asleep in her bedroom. Her parents were sleeping in another part of the house, unaware of anything unusual. It had taken Becky a while to fall asleep because in a few hours, she was supposed to star as the narrator of the first grade school play at her elementary school. Her outfit for the day, a simple halter top and skirt, and her paper sack costume already laid out on a chair. She had recited her lines proudly when her father came home late from the family restaurant they owned, then finally went to bed. But what nobody knew was that someone else had been watching that night, someone who didn't belong there. Bryan Frederick Jennings, just 20 years old and stationed with the U.S. Marines in Okinawa, Japan, had returned to Merritt Island for a short visit with his mother. That night, after drinking at a local bar with a friend, Bryan slipped away alone. He had a habit of roaming neighborhoods after dark, lurking near windows and watching from the shadows. It wasn't something he ever told his friends about, but this time his habit took a darker turn. As he walked, he noticed a faint glow coming from a nearby house. It was a nightlight, soft and dim, shining through a little girl's window. Bryan stopped and watched, and for reasons even he couldn't name, he didn't walk on. Something made him stay. Moments later, he moved closer. He took out the screen, slid the window open, and slipped inside. Becky barely stirred before a hand covered her mouth. Bryan lifted her from the bed, carried her out through the yard, and laid her in his car. From there, he drove toward the Girard Street Canal on Merritt Island, a quiet, isolated spot where no one would hear a sound. What happened next was brutal. Bryan her, using such force that both he and Becky got visible injuries down under, but it didn't end there. In a burst of rage, he lifted Becky by the legs and slammed her onto the ground so hard that the impact fractured her skull. She was still alive when he dragged her to the canal's edge. There, he forced her head underwater and held it down, waiting until she stopped moving. Then he let her go, leaving her in the water for the alligators to find. It was over in minutes. Becky, who had fallen asleep with the lines of her school play still in mind, never made it to the morning. Only a few hours later, a fisherman noticed something floating in the canal. It was Becky. Her small body had drifted to the surface, silent and still in the murky water. Within minutes, deputies flooded the area, and within hours, investigators began piecing together the horror of what had happened that night and the name that would soon emerge behind it. That same day, Bryan was pulled over in Orange County for a minor traffic violation. He didn't resist. He answered questions, stayed calm, and even agreed to come to the police station. There, he seemed calm and cooperative. Nothing about him hinted at the horror that had unfolded hours earlier. But as detectives shared information across departments, the evidence began pointing directly to him. Moreover, the fingerprints they took at the station appeared to be exact matches to the ones found at Becky's bedroom window. At that moment, they knew he was the one they were looking for. In the early morning hours of May 12th, deputies woke him in his jail cell and brought him to an interrogation room. They read him his rights, and Bryan immediately asked for a lawyer. His voice cracked when he said it. "I have to have a lawyer for this. This is too heavy for me to do." But later he changed his mind, so detectives started the interrogation without one. At first, Bryan denied everything. He claimed he didn't even know who Becky was. But when the detectives pressed him with the evidence, his fingerprints, and his timeline, his answers began to falter. His story cracked, and then so did he. In a flat, emotionless tone, Bryan confessed. He told them he had taken Becky, assaulted her, and drowned her in the canal, and his statement opened the door to even more evidence. His clothes had her DNA on them, and he made drawings and hand-sketched maps with things only the one responsible would know. These sketches were later used in court as well. After his arrest, Bryan was charged with first-degree murder, kidnapping, and sexual battery. And from the beginning, prosecutors made it clear they were going to seek the death penalty. In June 1979, a judge ruled that Bryan's taped confession could be used in court, finding that even though there was no lawyer present when he confessed, he had spoken voluntarily and not under pressure. His trial began the following year in Brevard County. The courtroom stayed silent as the jury listened to the tape of Bryan's confession. They heard his voice, calm and cold, walking through what he did. A former cellmate testified that Bryan had bragged about the killing behind bars. 2 fingerprint analysts confirmed that his prints were found on Becky's window, proving that he was the one who broke in and took her. And when the defense tried to argue that Bryan was mentally ill, a psychiatrist shut it down. He told the jury Bryan wasn't insane. He wasn't confused. He was a predator, fully aware of what was right and wrong, but simply didn't care. Bryan's attorneys pointed to a childhood full of instability. He never knew who his real father was, and even his mother, Margaret Dana, once admitted she wasn't sure either. From the beginning, Bryan's life lacked structure. He was born prematurely and showed signs of behavioral problems before he could even form full sentences. Doctors noticed something was off early on, but no one offered real help. For the first 5 or 6 years of his life, Bryan lived with his grandparents instead of his mom. And when he did live with her, it was never steady. She bounced between jobs, and men drifted in and out of their lives without sticking around. Bryan was often left behind and forced to move and switch schools every few years because of her work. By the time he was 12, he had already begun sneaking out of the house and taking his mother's car on joyrides until morning. But despite the chaos, Bryan wasn't unintelligent. A doctor even noted that his IQ was above average. He made it to 10th grade, but then dropped out. At one point, a physician recommended he be institutionalized in Boston for long-term psychiatric care. But when Bryan told his mother he wanted to join the military instead, she backed out. She was afraid that a hospital stay would destroy his chances of ever finding government work. So he joined the military, and that decision didn't help. It only made things worse. At the time of the crime, Bryan was on leave from the U.S. Marine Corps and staying with his family on Merritt Island. But his military background didn't hide his troubled past. As a teenager, he had been arrested multiple times for burglary and trespassing, and he openly admitted to a long-standing problem with voyeurism. On February 7, 1980, the jury found Bryan guilty of first-degree murder, kidnapping, burglary, and sexual battery, and 4 days later, they voted 11-1 to recommend the death penalty. The judge agreed, and on May 7, 1980, sentenced Bryan to death, along with 4 life terms for the other charges. But that wasn't the end of it. The legal battle stretched on for decades. The Florida Supreme Court overturned his conviction not once but twice, which led to retrials in 1982 and again in 1986. Each time, jurors heard the same horrifying story about how Becky's life was taken. And each time, they came back with the same answer: guilty and death. And every new hearing reopened old wounds for Becky's family, forcing them to relive the loss of their youngest daughter again and again. On April 25, 1986, Bryan was sentenced to death for the 3rd and final time. But the legal battle didn't stop. For the next 40 years, he filed appeal after appeal, arguing his trial had been unfair or that his mental illness had not been properly considered. But in the end, each attempt failed. The courts upheld his sentence, ruling that the evidence and his confession left no doubt about his guilt. The sentence stood. Then, on October 10, 2025, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis finally signed his death warrant, scheduling Bryan's execution for November 13th. His attorneys made one last attempt to stop it, but the courts wouldn't budge. Becky would have been 53 years old by then. Instead, she never made it past 6. On the morning of his execution, Bryan woke before sunrise, around 4 a.m. He ate his final meal later that day, a cheeseburger, fries, and a soda. No one came to see him that day. According to prison officials, he spent his final hours alone. Just before 6 p.m., he was led to the execution chamber. When asked if he had any final words, Bryan responded with a firm no. He didn't offer an apology, not to the victim's family or to anyone else in the room. As the drugs began to flow, his chest lifted sharply and his arms twitched against the gurney. For a few minutes, the movement continued, but then it stopped. His body fell still, with his mouth hanging open. He was pronounced dead at 6:20 p.m. Bryan Frederick Jennings was 66 years old. Just one day later, the next execution took place, this time in South Carolina. On November 14, 2025, after spending more than 17 years on death row, Stephen Corey Bryant was executed by firing squad. But how did he end up there? It all started on October 5, 2004. Stephen, just 23 years old at the time, needed money, and he was growing more desperate by the day. He spent his time roaming the rural backroads of Sumter County, keeping an eye on the quiet homes tucked behind trees, the ones with long driveways and no neighbors nearby. Stephen would walk up during the day, claiming he was looking for someone or that his truck had broken down. He smiled, waved, and acted harmless. And it worked. Neighbors thought nothing of it. But Stephen wasn't lost. He was scouting. The day after visiting one house, he came back, but this time there was no knock. He slipped inside, walked through the rooms, and ransacked the home office, grabbing whatever valuables he could carry before disappearing again. And he didn't stop there. Not long after, Stephen broke into another empty house, and this time he cut the phone lines so nobody could call for help when the owners returned. Then he found a .40 caliber Smith & Wesson and a box of ammunition. And at this point, he wasn't just stealing anymore. Each break-in was building toward something. He was gearing up, preparing for what was coming next. Just hours after stealing the gun, he went out to test it. Along a quiet riverbank, he spotted a man, 56-year-old Clinton Brown, who was fishing alone. Without any warning, Stephen raised the gun and fired once, then ran. The bullet hit Clinton in the upper body, and against all odds, Clinton stayed conscious. Bleeding and stunned, he climbed into his truck and drove himself to the nearest hospital. Clinton survived, but for Stephen, this was only the beginning. 4 days later, Stephen met up with a longtime friend, 36-year-old Clifton Gainey. They had fished together, shared meals, and their families had spent weekends under the same roof. That night, they left to buy beer, laughing like they always did. And then somewhere between the jokes, Stephen pulled the same stolen gun and shot Clifton in the head. His friend died instantly. Stephen didn't call for help. He didn't stop to check if his friend was still breathing. He just stepped over the body, left it in the dirt on a lonely stretch of road, and drove straight to Clifton's rented trailer. Once inside, he took everything he could carry, electronics, an aquarium, and whatever looked like it might be worth a few bucks. Then he struck a match. Flames tore through the trailer, burning up memories, photos, and the place where their families used to gather like nothing had ever mattered. But 2 days later, on October 11th, Stephen struck again. This time, his target was 62-year-old Willard Tietjen, a retired Air Force sergeant living in peace. Stephen forced his way inside his home, shot him 9 times, then tore through the home looking for anything valuable. While he was ransacking the house, the phone rang multiple times. On the other end of the line were TJ's wife and daughter, desperate for answers. Stephen answered both calls. Calmly, he told each of them that TJ was dead. Before he walked out, he slipped a ring from TJ's hand and burned his face with a cigarette. And then, as if daring the police to stop him, he dipped a finger into blood and smeared a message across the wall. "Victim 4 in 2 weeks. Catch me if you can." And just like that, the clock started ticking. The manhunt was on. From that moment, everything moved fast. Over the past days, investigators in Sumter County worked around the clock, combing through every detail from the past 2 weeks. What stood out first was the pattern. 3 attacks, all within a few miles of each other, all in less than 2 weeks. And the crime scenes weren't random. The gunshot wounds were similar, the shell casings matched, and not a single sign of a struggle. The more detectives uncovered, the clearer it became. This wasn't coincidence. It was a spree. One man, moving fast, who was killing with precision and daring the police to stop him. And then came the break. Tips started flooding in from across the county. Sightings of a dark and worn 1990 GMC pickup spotted near more than one crime scene. One caller had even caught a part of the license plate. And when officers ran it through their system, it led straight to Stephen, a man already known to the police for committing violent burglaries. The truck wasn't just a match. It was the missing link, and it tied Stephen to every single detail they had been piecing together. And then, on October 13th, ballistic testing confirmed what the detectives already suspected. The same weapon had been used in all 4 shootings. And that match sealed the case. Stephen Bryant was responsible for the killing spree. But by then, it was too late. Because just hours earlier, at around 4:30 a.m., Stephen had met his last victim. 35-year-old Christopher Burgess was standing outside a small convenience store when Stephen approached him. They spoke briefly before they left together. What exactly was said in those few minutes will never be known. But somewhere along the way, Stephen pulled out the gun one more time and shot Christopher, once in the chest and once in the head. His body was discovered less than 2 hours later by a passing hunter. That same afternoon, officers finally tracked Stephen down to his girlfriend's house, and when they confronted him, he didn't run, didn't fight, and when they walked him out in cuffs, the spree that had gripped Sumter County finally ended. Inside the house, detectives found the stolen goods, weapons, and evidence that tied him to the murders. Stephen was arrested and charged with 3 counts of murder, along with burglary, armed robbery, arson, and weapons violations. In the months that followed, people in Sumter County were still trying to make sense of it all. Stephen's landlord described him as quiet and polite, the kind of tenant who kept to himself. And at work, his supervisor described him as a nice person. But court-appointed psychologists saw something else entirely. They described Stephen as impulsive and antisocial, a man with no ability to control his anger or understand consequences. And that pattern didn't stop with the murders. While waiting for trial, Stephen lashed out once again. He attacked a corrections officer without warning, and not long after, he was caught throwing urine at another inmate. Prosecutors brought that up later, calling it more proof of who he really was and why he couldn't be trusted outside a cell. His trial didn't begin until 2008, 4 years after the murders, and when it finally did, there was no twist, no last-minute deal. On August 8th, Stephen stood before the court and admitted to everything, 3 murders and 9 other charges. He didn't ask for leniency, and no bargain was offered. Sumter County Prosecutor Kelly Jackson made it clear the state would seek the death penalty for the murder of TJ. But since Stephen had already pleaded guilty, the trial moved straight to the sentencing phase. That's when his lawyers tried to shift the focus away from the crime and toward the years that came before it. They painted a picture of a broken kid who never had a shot. Stephen had been in and out of state institutions since he was 11. School records described him as emotionally unstable and slow to learn. In September 2004, just weeks before the murders, he had actually reached out for help, contacting mental health agencies and asking for counseling. After his arrest, doctors diagnosed him with PTSD from years of sexual abuse, along with chronic depression and ADD. His grandmother took the stand during sentencing, her voice trembling as she recounted how, just months before the murders, Stephen had broken down and told her everything. He told her about the abuse by his grandfather, his uncle, and even his half-brother. He had begged for help. She and her daughter had even contacted a deputy, trying to get him the right kind of treatment. But whatever help he got, it wasn't enough. And within weeks, that buried trauma exploded into violence. And by the end of it, 3 men were dead. But prosecutors pushed back hard. They said the story of a broken boy didn't hold up in the face of the facts. This wasn't trauma spiraling out of control, it was cold, calculated murder. Each killing, they argued, was deliberate. Stephen hadn't snapped, he had hunted. He had planned every move and executed it without hesitation. And once the jury heard it laid out like that, whatever sympathy they might have had vanished, and they sided with the state. Then, on September 11, 2008, Judge Thomas Russo delivered the verdict. Stephen was sentenced to die for the murder of Willard Tietjen. The crime was seen as especially cruel because it happened during a robbery. For the murders of Clifton Gainey and Christopher Burgess, he received 2 life sentences to run at the same time. But it didn't stop there. He also got decades more for a long list of other crimes: burglaries, arson, assault, and even threats he made behind bars to a correctional officer. For the next years, Stephen fought the sentence, filing appeal after appeal. He claimed mental illness and lasting brain damage caused by prenatal alcohol exposure. But no court bought it. Each one reviewed the records, weighed the evidence, and turned him down. In January 2025, the 4th U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals dismissed his final appeal, and 9 months later, the U.S. Supreme Court did the same. Just 3 days later, on October 17, 2025, the South Carolina Supreme Court signed his death warrant. Under state law, death row inmates could choose between lethal injection, the electric chair, or firing squad. And on October 31st, Stephen made his choice. He wanted to die the same way as his victims, so he chose the firing squad. For his final meal, Stephen asked for a spicy seafood stir-fry packed with heat, along with fried fish served over rice. He also requested egg rolls, stuffed shrimp, 2 candy bars, and a slice of German chocolate cake. Then the moment came. On November 14, 2025, Stephen sat strapped to the execution chair, motionless as the warden asked if he had any final words. He didn't speak, just shook his head. No last statement, no apology for what he did. He glanced briefly at the 10 witnesses seated behind the glass, but then turned back toward the firing squad. 3 corrections officers stood behind the wall, armed with live rounds, ready to carry out the sentence. A hood was placed over his head and a target strapped over his heart. He made several heavy breaths during the 2 minutes from when the hood was placed over his head to the shots being fired. The execution was carried out by a firing squad armed with rifles loaded with .308 Winchester rounds, ammunition known for its devastating impact, and they are designed to fragment on contact. A direct hit to the heart could end a life in seconds. In South Carolina, they don't use blanks. All 3 rifles were loaded. The 3 volunteers stand behind a wall with a small opening, not visible to witnesses. And after the warden reads the execution order, the officers fire. The curtains opened at 6:01 p.m. About 55 seconds later, the command was given, and the shots rang out. Stephen made no sound. The paper bullseye taped to his chest ripped forward from the impact. His body tensed, then loosened. A few shallow breaths followed by a final spasm came just over a minute later. A doctor stepped forward with a stethoscope, leaned in, and confirmed what everyone already knew. At 6:05 p.m., he was pronounced dead. Stephen Corey Bryant was 44 years old. The last execution took place on November 20th. After spending more than 36 years on death row, Richard Barry Randolph was executed by lethal injection in Florida. But what did he do? It was just after sunrise on August 15, 1988, a quiet Monday morning in Palatka, when the first customers pulled into the Handyway store parking lot. The clock had barely struck 7, but something felt off. They expected to see Minnie Ruth McCollum, the manager behind the counter, like always, greeting them with her usual nod. But instead, they saw something that didn't make sense. The doors were still locked, even though the lights inside were on. Then, a familiar face appeared. Richard Randolph. He was wearing a Handyway smock and casually stepped out of the store and started locking the doors from the inside. Dorothy and Deborah Patilla, both regulars at the store, called out to him. "Where's Minnie?" they asked. Richard smiled, calm as ever, and told them her car had broken down, that she had borrowed his to get it fixed, and he was just heading out to pick her up. Then he slid into Minnie's own car and drove away. The women waited a moment, but then they started to feel uneasy. His story didn't make sense at all, so they tried to open the locked door, pulled on the handle, then pressed their faces to the glass, and what they saw made their stomachs turn. The ceiling camera wasn't where it should be, only the wire where it once was. And in the trash can, the rest of the wire stuck out. The counter looked like it had been ransacked, and the door leading to the back room, normally wide open, was almost shut now. That was enough. Something had clearly gone wrong, and they called the sheriff. When deputies got there, they had to force the door open, and what they found inside was worse than anyone expected. Behind that half-closed door lay Minnie, flat on her back, barely clinging to life. Blood soaked through the floor beneath her. A knife lay near her head. She was still breathing, but just barely, and she couldn't speak. Her body looked broken. Paramedics worked quickly, trying to keep her alive long enough to reach the hospital. And while they fought to save her, Richard was already miles away. After leaving the Handyway, he had taken Minnie's car and driven straight to his girlfriend's house, a modest place where Norma Janine Betts lived with their young daughter. Richard walked in and told her he had robbed the store. Then, like he was just venting about a rough shift, he added that he had hurt Minnie, barely flinching as the words left his mouth. And instead of making it right, he said he was off to Jacksonville to cash in some lottery tickets he had taken. He promised he would come back soon, and when he did, they would leave everything behind and start fresh in North Carolina. Richard didn't know it yet, but the police were already closing in, because by then investigators had connected the dots. Richard had once worked at that same Handyway store. He knew the layout, the morning routines, the location of the safe, and which customers usually stopped by. His familiarity with the store gave him an edge, but it also gave detectives a starting point. The very next day, the police tracked him down to Jacksonville. They found him sitting outside a Save-A-Lot, waiting for money that would never come. When the officers approached him, he didn't run, and once they read him his rights, he started talking. Richard said the plan he had was simple. He had brought a toy gun, slipped into the store, and hoped to get in and out without anyone noticing. But it didn't go that way. Minnie caught him in the act, and Richard panicked. "She was tougher than I thought," he admitted. He said he struck her over and over until she stopped moving. Then he turned his focus to the safe. He tried to open it but couldn't, and when he saw Minnie move just slightly, he used the drawstring from his sweatshirt to strangle her. Afterward, he found a scrap of paper with what looked like the safe combination, but even then, it wouldn't open. So he grabbed what he could, a bundle of lottery tickets and her car keys, and headed for the door. Richard thought it was over, but then he heard her again, Minnie gasping, panicking, trying to move, and something in him snapped all over again. He came back and beat her until she went still, but her body kept fighting. So he pulled out a small knife and slashed at her over and over until the floor was soaked with blood. And when that still didn't stop her movements, he tightened the drawstring, desperate to finish what he started. At this point, he realized he needed a cover story, something wild enough to throw off the police. so he tore at her clothes, raped her, then changed into a handyway uniform to hide what he had really been wearing. He yanked the store's security camera out of the ceiling and tossed it into the trash, as if this would erase what he had done. Then he locked the door behind him, climbed into Minnie's car, and drove away. On the road to Jacksonville, Richard stopped at several convenience stores to cash stolen lottery tickets while throwing away the losers as he went. At a McDonald's, he dumped his blood-stained shoes and clothes into a trash bin, then just kept driving like none of it mattered. But when detectives tracked him down and brought him back to Putnam County, they retraced every step, recovering the tickets, the clothes, and all the evidence they needed. Richard's trial started in April 1989. Prosecutors charged him with first-degree murder, armed robbery, sexual battery, and grand theft of a motor vehicle. And prosecutors didn't need to exaggerate. The evidence was impossible to ignore. They had Richard's own confession, the stolen car, the clothes he ditched, and the blood that linked it all together. But the real weight came during the sentencing phase, because that's when the state turned to the jury and walked them through everything Minnie had endured. They reminded the jury that Richard didn't just attack her, he left her clinging to life. She spent 6 days in a hospital bed before her body finally gave out. The medical examiner described her injuries in detail. Her skull and face had been crushed, her neck cut, and her jaw shattered. A trauma surgeon said it looked like she had been struck repeatedly, and a neurologist testified that in 20 years he had never seen swelling that severe, only in high-speed car crashes. Still, the defense tried to shift the focus. A psychologist took the stand and tried to explain where Richard came from. He had been adopted as a baby, struggled to fit in at school, and was sent to therapy before he was even 10 years old. His adoptive mother dealt with severe mental illness, and his father used beatings as punishment, tying him up and striking him with whatever he could find. By the time Richard reached adulthood, those early wounds had turned him into something much more dangerous. But even with his fractured upbringing and emotional instability, Richard still held things together, at least on the surface. He graduated high school, joined the Army, and even earned an honorable discharge, but the discipline of military life didn't fix what was unraveling inside. While enlisted, he began experimenting with drugs, first with marijuana, then came cocaine. By 1984, he was deep into crack, a habit that would hollow out the person he used to be. The psychologist who evaluated him later said crack doesn't always show its damage on the outside. It creeps in quietly, changing behavior, twisting judgment, and chipping away at self-control. In Richard's case, he believed the addiction had reshaped his thinking entirely. According to the psychologist, that morning at the handyway, it wasn't hate that pulled the trigger. It was desperation. The experts said Richard showed real shame and regret afterward, that he wasn't a man full of hate, but one who lost control. Richard had gone there to steal, not to kill. But when the situation spun out of control, his panic and addiction took over. His now ex-girlfriend Norma told the court she remembered a different version of Richard. The man she met back in North Carolina worked steady jobs and made her laugh. But that changed after they moved to Palatka. Richard started hanging out with the wrong people, and the drugs, especially crack, took over. The man she loved seemed to disappear. When he came home that morning and told her what he had done, she didn't believe him. He didn't even look high, she said, but she didn't know what he might have used the night before. Still, the jury couldn't look past the violence. Whatever he used to be, whatever excuses were given, none of it outweighed the bloodshed of that morning. All 12 jurors found him guilty on all counts. And when it came time for sentencing, 8 chose death while 4 voted to spare him. But eventually, the judge sided with the majority. On April 5, 1989, Richard Barry Randolph was sentenced to die. Years after his conviction, Richard came across something that made him see his entire life in a new light. A change in New York law gave him the right to access his original birth certificate, something he had never laid eyes on. Until then, he had believed the story told to him as a child that his birth mother had been a college student who wasn't ready to raise a child. But that wasn't true. She had actually been a 17-year-old high school girl. And both his biological parents hadn't just moved on, they had graduated from college, built careers, and led quiet, stable, and healthy lives. There was no sign of mental illness, no history of addiction, and no trace of the chaos that had haunted Richard from the start. His lawyers argued that this new information wasn't just a personal revelation. It proved that Richard's violent behavior hadn't been inherited, but shaped by the cruelty of his upbringing. The years of beatings, neglect, and instability under his adoptive parents had twisted him long before the drugs ever did. They claimed this discovery, backed by an expert testimony on adoption trauma, could have convinced a jury to spare his life. But the truth came too late, long after the verdict was sealed and the sentence signed. The circuit court didn't buy it. Without even granting a hearing, the judge dismissed Richard's motion. In the ruling, the court said that even if the new information about his biological parents was true, it didn't meet the legal threshold. The evidence wasn't relevant. It didn't explain his actions, and it didn't change how the crime unfolded. So Richard stayed on death row. And after 36 years, a date was finally set, November 20th, 2025. That morning, Richard woke up at 6:30 a.m. Later that day, he was given his final meal, which included a cheeseburger, fries, and ice cream. Richard had one visitor, but did not meet with a spiritual advisor. Just before 6 p.m., he was strapped to the gurney. 3 of the victims' family members sat in the witness room, silent, and waiting for something that had been hanging over their heads for the past 36 years. A prison guard leaned in and asked if he had any last words, but Richard simply said, "No." No apology, no explanation, nothing at all. Moments later, the drugs began to flow. The process moved forward without complications. After a few minutes, the prison staff performed the usual checks, and at 6:12 p.m., Richard was officially pronounced dead. Richard Barry Randolph was 63 years old. That concludes all executions carried out in November 2025. If you liked this video, make sure to check out the next one, because just when you thought it couldn't get worse, well, it can. And the next cases are even more disturbing.